Hi everyone. Hope everything is okay with you. We are in today's Wednesday's lecture. I decided to change a little bit with coming back to another A&M background, so I hope you like it. Quick thing before I begin as usual. Today I'll begin a series of 3 lectures will take place over the next 3 meetings that we're going to have talking about what is almost our last topic for the semester, which is I call that in the syllabus new terrorism, which is different types of terrorism, different than the conventional ones. We'll talk about one today, and of course also one on Friday and next Monday, which is almost our last lecture. Last lecture was going to be, as it's planned right now, is for next Wednesday. So that's going to be our last lecture. Quick reminder that your final paper and presentation is due on the 27th, which is less than 2 weeks away. So if you have any questions about it, you're more than welcome to talk with me about it. So to begin today, let me put the slides on. So today we'll begin talking about cyber terrorism. As usual, beforehand, a quick reminder: on Monday's meeting, I completed a discussion about counterterrorism, mostly focusing on using our different theoretical approaches to explain variations in the counterterrorism choices of different states. Some of these explanations included using, for example, the strategic approach to explain the role that domestic politics play in the selection of what we learned eventually are non-optimal counterterrorism policies. The main idea was that because politicians are mostly concerned with survival in office, they care about public opinion, and because for the public the issue of terrorism is salient, the politicians are usually they're more likely to select policy options which are observable, such as putting roadblocks or stuff like that, which are more observable by the public, so the public is aware that the politicians are indeed doing something about those terrorism issues. While in reality, those kinds of policies are not necessarily the most effective one compared to more covert method, but covert methods are not observable to the public, so it's less efficient, less maximizing the utility of the politician. So again, thinking about it in a strategic point of view, this is the implementation of a less effective counterterrorism policies in order to accomplish a different goal, not the goal of preventing terrorism. So that was one explanation. I talked about the organizational approach, how intergroup rivalry between different security organizations might lead to ineffective policy options, the effect of standard operational procedures, SOPs, with the example of Ireland. In the psychological category, this was mostly risk perception with the example, the differences between Obama and Bush. How do their different risk profiles impact their preferred policy options facing terrorism? Then a little bit about ideological approach, some of its main finding. Then the structural approach, state capacity, how important it is to have enough capacity from the judicial aspect, from intelligence, from security, in order to choose more selective counterterrorism policies compared to those countries that do not have this capacity, and that lead them to select more indiscriminate types of policies, the effect of regime type, of course, and then the points raised by the critical approach, that counterterrorism is just another tool for the government to consolidate its power, and it does not really provide the goal that it was intended to, is to reduce terrorism. So if you have any questions on this topic, you're more than welcome to send them to me. And now I want to move on and talk about cyber terrorism. So as we always did when we raised a new topic, we began with defining this concept and what are the boundaries, what are the scope conditions for those topics. Such as similar to the most previous topics, cyber terrorism is also another concept which lacks consensus definition. The wider that we make the definition, the more cases can fit to what cyber terrorism is. So one thing I want to do is to take one example for a definition that is out there, is accepted by many in the US government, and it's also based on the paper that you had to read for today, and see how are the different aspects that we can think about. So in any definition, we would like to know, for example, who is the target, and here you can see in bold the target is against computers, networks, and information stored in those platforms. So that's the target for cyber terrorism. We can think about the objective, which for terrorism as a whole, the objective is always generate wide-scale fear. So again, as it is bolded here in this definition, it intended to coerce the government, to intimidate the people, and it has political and social objectives, which again, so far is also similar in this aspect, is very similar to definition terrorism, the definition of terrorism as a whole. Specific elements, in this case, this is the specific elements for the cyberspace aspects of terrorism. Attack should result in violence against persons or property, or at least cause some harm in order to generate fear. Okay, so as a psychological mechanism of fear is important here. And lastly, they even offer here some examples regarding what is cyber terrorism. So it has to lead to some kind of injuries, explosions, plane crashes, water contamination, and stuff like that. Attacks against critical infrastructure. All of that are examples for what can be termed cyber terrorism. Now, one of the big problems with taking this kind of definition is, as you can see, it's very, very long. So if I just go back one more time to this example, there is about 10, 11 rows of definition. It's not a very concise one, which makes it much harder to use that, whether it is in the research standpoint, but even more so when we think about policy. If policymakers have to use this kind of wide definition, there's a lot of cases that may fit cyber terrorism, but it's going to be very hard to pinpoint which cases may not fit cyber terrorism. Few other related aspects. So there's a lot of professionals and scholars that mention the risk of cyber attacks by terrorists. And one of the contributing factors, according to those arguments, is change in the structural conditions, when in this case is the globalization. So globalization made the access to the technologies much easier and allowed it to expand a lot easier the pool of supporters and recruits. And we'll talk in a minute about some of the main reasons why do we use cyber terrorism. The main vulnerabilities or the most critical targets when we think about attacks by terrorists in cyberspace is what's called critical information infrastructures. Those have high connectivity to the internet. And just as an example, let's think about the consequences of a cyber attack on a power plant in a major city. So for example, it can shut down transportation. It can cause traffic accidents, interrupt emergency services, do not provide electricity for hospitals, for schools, for stuff like that. There's other examples that scholars mentioned, including terrorism hacking into the air traffic control systems or contamination of food products through interference with the manufacturing process. So those are all attacks that are targeting critical infrastructure, and their outcomes eventually might be very, very wide scale in terms of multiple casualties, damages, economic, and others. So that's when we think about the most extreme version of cyber attacks by terrorists, that is what is usually mentioned. The next question, when we are still talking about a definition or just introducing the topic of cyber terrorism, is the question is, why should we use it? So first of all, the cost is relatively very, very low. There's a very increased potential for the attackers to remain anonymous. We can target a lot of different assets. It doesn't have to be just cities. It can be individuals. It can be government facilities. It can be private facilities. There's a lot of targets that can be attacked. Any target that is connected to the internet in that case can be targeted. It allows the perpetrators to attack their targets from a remote location. They do not have to be present in that location. And it has, just like these examples that I talked about in the previous slide, the potential for many, many casualties if those attacks are indeed implemented the way that they are planned. A few more aspects that are related to those 5 factors. So by using cyber tools, terrorists can create a lot of damages, a lot of casualties. They do not even have to use what is more common for the use of terrorism attacks: explosive, firearms, and just the conventional tools. So it provides a lot of advantage because conventional tools are the things that governments that fight terrorism seek the most, and they seek a lot less the use of computer networks and cyber tools as a whole. Also related to a previous point is the ability to plan and execute simultaneous attacks around the globe using this domain. It does not require to install multiple operatives in sensitive locations and coordinate a physical attack that all of them do together. So coordination, planning attacks like at 9/11 was very, very complicated. If terrorists are interested in executing a similar attack using cyber tools, they do not have to make a lot of those plans in advance. So that's a few more reasons and benefits of using cyber terrorism. Now, beyond those benefits, which we can think about as more practical, there are also theoretical mechanisms that allow us to think about why would terrorists, which are very, very used to employ conventional tools, will decide to turn to those kinds of alternative methods. So one mechanism you're aware of, we talked about it a few times in past lecture, which is substitution. If some of the counterterrorism tools that governments employ makes the existing methods that terrorists implement less effective, then they can substitute to others, right? So the use of cyber methods in this case can replace methods that are harder to implement, because the government can implement its own strong defensive measures, such as border security when the government implements, or police watch lists. So you can actually overcome a lot of those defensive measures by using cyber tools. So you just do substitution, just like we talked about substitution within different conventional methods. So overall, just substituting between conventional method to cyber tools can be one reason to turn to those methods. The other one is what's called diversification. Since terrorists mostly operate in an environment which is uncertain, by adding another method, so in this case, they are adding cyber terrorism, not substituting cyber tools with conventional tools, but adding cyber tools to their, what's called, we can think about it as a portfolio. First of all, it reduces the predictability of their actions. It forces states to extend their defensive capabilities, because the states now have to be concerned also for attacks based on cyber tools and not just conventional tools. It helps them overcome their obvious disadvantages in resources and personnel. One of the important aspects, some research on diversification more generally of tactics for the use of force have argued that usually diversification is implemented what's called preemptively. So it's not a response that the government implements some counterterrorism policies, so the terrorists decide to add cyber to their portfolio. No, it's done preemptively. It's just another reason for terrorists to diversify their portfolio, to diversify the tools that they have in order to accomplish their goals. And related to this, there is evidence in some research that diversifying tools, not related to cyber tools, but just diversifying the tactics that terror groups or rebel groups use, have actually lead to political success. Audrey Cronin showed in her research that groups that diversify their tools have higher chances to accomplish some of their political goals. So for example, some of those groups are able to accomplish goals such as securing formal talks with the local government. So that's one reason why diversification works. So all this discussion presents the potential for a lot of appeal to use cyber terrorism, but we should also think about why not. There are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, terrorists need to acquire the right level of expertise to execute such complex operations. And as it stands today, terror groups still lack those skills, especially in terms of wide populations of individuals who are willing to offer those skills for terrorists. Two more things that are related to the effects of terrorism. So cyber attacks have effects which are less grandiose. It provides less images of fear and multiple casualties. Compare the results from an attack on a banking institution and stealing funds from banks compared to attack using explosives or firearms. So the difference in images which create those fear, which is a very important mechanism for terrorists, is very different. So it's less appealing maybe to terrorists. Related to that is the effects are usually takes longer to materialize. They are rarely in immediate effects. You don't get those immediate images of explosions and injuries and casualties, which terrorists are really much looking for. So all this makes the use of terrorism maybe less appealing, especially for the creation of general public fear. So the final question before we go a little bit more into a deeper analysis of questions about cyber terrorism is, where do we stand today? So by 2020, or more likely the end of 2019, we don't have cases of cyber attacks that terror groups have perpetrated, clear cases. Especially we don't have cases with casualties which were directly resulted from cyber attacks by terror groups. The vast majority of cyber attacks are conducted by state actors. Some of the examples for that, you may be aware of some of them. The joint operation by Israel and the United States against Iran's nuclear program, what's called the Stuxnet malware. The idea behind this operation was to insert malware into the operation systems of one of Iran's nuclear reactors, and to actually create a reaction that's gonna just create damages from within, and it had to be not identified. That was the idea behind it. Right at the bottom of this slide, as you can see here, this is a link to a short, about a 3-4 minutes video, which provides some explanation about it. You're more than welcome to press that later on after you get the slides and watch the video. It's actually a pretty interesting one, provides some more of the details of how this operation took place. Some countries complement their use of conventional offensive operations with cyber tools. For example, Russia did just that in its recent, it's not that recent now, it's almost 10 years ago, operations in Estonia and Georgia. So they used cyber tools to attack the infrastructure of those countries, while they were also using kinetic weapons. Israel did some similar things over the last couple of years in its handling with Hamas in Gaza. The other known cases are mostly involving the steal of information by hackers and non-state actors. Some of the famous cases are the information stealing from Uber in 2016, and the White House OPM in 2015, and the most famous one probably for all of us is the attacks on the DNC right before the 2016 elections that we are aware of. So those are the most famous cases. So first of all, we want to think about, before going deeper into detail, we can think about how can we look a little bit maybe more into the details and trying to find evidence for terrorism in cyberspace. So there are some cases, as I said, most of them are indirect, and they fit to the category of complementary to conventional attacks. And mostly, as I said earlier, they do not generate direct loss of life. So some of those examples from the last couple of years. So in 2015, the United States military forces attacked an ISIS cell led by an individual called Junaid Hussein, who spread online propaganda using, again, cyber tools. He also helped recruit the man who eventually opened fire on citizens in Garland, Texas. So again, this is an indirect use of cyber tools to generate terror attacks. So that's one example. In 2017, Israel arrested and charged a terror operative that hacked into the video feed of the IDF drones who flew missions over Gaza during the previous years. This individual also admitted to hacking into systems that monitor the civilian air traffic control in Israel's main airport, right next to Tel Aviv. and some of the transportation authority parameters. So there is some evidence. It's very, very limited. And in most cases, it did not generate any direct cost of life and an indirect effect, such as the American case. But there is some evidence that we begin to find terror attacks by by terrorists that use cyber tools. The more common use of computer networks and cyber tools by terrorists are fit to two categories. The first is cybercrime. It's a fairly common use of computer networks and the internet connectivity around the globe by terrorists to steal funds and to finance the conventional operations. I've already had, about a week ago, I think I gave you the lecture about financing and how important it is financing and sponsoring of terror operations. So in that case, cyber tools provide an additional way to generate more funds. The more common use of computer technology by terrorists is what's called information warfare and propaganda. So that's tools used for recruitment and spreading propaganda across the globe, spreading misinformation against the target populations. And those are the main tools that terrorists use. So we have very little evidence for actual attacks of using cyber tools by terrorists. We have a lot more evidence for those two alternative methods, but that's the way that the research and the evidence that we have, the open source research, the open source evidence that we have at least today exists. For the remainder of today's lecture, I want to talk about specific issues that are relevant for cyber terrorism. The first is based on a paper by Poznansky and Prokosky, a paper from a couple of years ago. They talk about the questions of attribution and credit claiming, especially when it comes to cyberspace and terror groups, or in this case, this is the comparison of state to non-state groups. Secrecy and the anonymity are two defining feature in cyberspace, and the research have shown that there are a lot of benefits for secrecy in cyberspace, especially when it comes to deterrence within the context of conflict dynamics and escalations. But not all actors choose to remain anonymous when they use tools, the computer technology tools. For example, is the group, the Cyber Jihad, which is an Iranian group that after attacking the infrastructure in upstate New York, one of the dams in upstate New York, which did not cause much damages, it mostly was a see who we are kind of an attack. They also announced their role, so they did not remain anonymous. Groups that target government websites, and you're familiar with a lot of those cases that we hear in the news, also tend to take credit for their attack. So the logic of whether groups are willing to take credit for their attack or choose to remain anonymous mostly depends on the objective of the perpetrators, right? So the logic of deterrence, creating deterrence, actually is better fit to a nation actors because they want to remain anonymous but create some kind of deterrent effect on their rivals. They want to deter them from further aggression, from further actions that they're taking, but they prefer to remain anonymous and not to reveal themselves as nation state taking those kinds of actions. But for non-state actors, which again, terror groups are just part of this category, credit claiming is actually more logical because their goals are mostly involve signaling their credibility, influencing the public opinion and creating more fear and expanding recruitment and support overall. Since they have known a lower capacity in cyberspace, it also makes sense for them that once they are able to implement such attacks, they should take credit for those attacks because it, again, proves that they have the capability to implement cyber attacks. So the question of attribution is very, very important for terrorism as a whole, because governments who wants to design policy to counter terrorism need to know who are the perpetrators. So attribution is important. Now, research on this topic with regard to cyber space suggests that the forensics of such attacks are complicated. They can take a long time to actually identify the perpetrators. In many cases, in order to accurately identify who are the perpetrators of cyber attacks, we also need to take into consideration not just technical aspects, but also non-technical analysis, which include motives and opportunities. So we need to understand who has the capabilities to implement such those kinds of attacks. Since terror groups are they prefer to be known as the perpetrators of certain attacks, right? They want that we as the targets will know who perpetrated the attack. Then the attribution problem in cyber attacks makes it more likely that, again, terror groups will claim credit for their attacks. From a structural standpoint, non-state actors such as terror groups have less resources overall. It places them in a weaker position and disadvantage compared to nation states. So again, once they're able to execute attacks using cyber tools, it makes it much more likely that they will claim credit. But for these kinds of an attack, we can also use a strategic explanation in this case. The need of terror groups to generate credibility and signal a strong signal of resolve with respect to their political objectives makes it much more likely that they will announce their attack. So they will tell us that they have made this attacks using cyber tools. So since many terror groups have very limited capabilities when it comes to the use of terrorism, we can think about how exactly does taking credit for attacks leads eventually to the objective of the group in terms of generating strong signal of resolve in the cyber domain, of course. So in the early stage, when there is just the first series of attacks, those attacks are more likely to cause inconvenience, such as the attacks on government websites or on kinds of infrastructure, which do not actually create damages, but just groups that are trying to let it be known that they're the ones who made the attack. Once those groups are able to establish a track record of capability and ability to implement those kinds of attack, then they can move ahead and try to plan more large-scale attacks targeting mostly critical infrastructure. If they're able to implement those operations successfully, it signals a resolve and their capabilities in that case. And those signals are not intended just for, of course, for the target government, but also for the target audience. So we, as the population, are aware that everything that we have that is connected to the internet is under risk that being attacked by terrorists. And additional benefits, of course, is the ability to enlarge the pool of recruits, the pool of supporters, especially today with the extended access to technology globally. Groups who implement cyber attacks and take credit for that receive a lot more publicity and can attract more recruits to their ranks. Those recruits might not be just cyber warriors, the way they call it. They can be just conventional warriors. But again, it's a lot more recruits as support overall. As an example, in 2015, a group called the Syrian Electric Army hacked into the United States Army website, left multiple political messages which condemned the US involvement in Syria. Following this intrusion, they had an announcement which took credit for the attack. It was posted on Twitter. So they used Twitter in order to notify and to take credit for attacking the United States Army website. And again, the main objective for them was to demonstrate their capability and ensure that the US government takes their threats and their arguments seriously. The evidence for this attack showed that it had consequences, as some of the group's hackers, this specific group, were actually later identified and placed on the FBI's most wanted list. So again, this is just the dynamic of how a group can generate this credibility and actually accomplish some of its goals. The last point regarding attribution and credit claiming is that there are some types of actions which use cyber tools, which it makes less sense to claim credit for terrorists. It's actually better to remain anonymous. And that's mostly cyber crimes. As have said a couple of minutes ago, that this is one of the ways that terror groups are more likely to use cyber tools. If a terror group uses cyber tools to steal funds, the objective of financing any type of terror operations, they are more likely, and it makes more sense to remain anonymous. The reasons are mostly, first, not revealing their identity can allow them to implement similar operations in the future, and again, to secure a more steady source of financing. Second is to prevent the potential target from suspecting that an attack is looming. This can be a cyber attack after this first cyber crime attack, but it can also be a kinetic attack. If the stolen funds are intended to finance such an operation, then remaining anonymous may be critical for the success of the much more larger attack. Next, I want to talk about the public reactions to the threat of cyber terrorism. With the public being the main target of terrorism as a whole, it is important to understand this in the context of cyberspace. Before I move on to the last topic for today's lecture, I want to just stop for a minute for our attendance word. So attendance words for today will be cloudy, which is the weather we had until earlier today. So cloudy is the attendance word for today. And now let's talk about the public and cyber terrorism. So terror attacks as a whole tend to target the public, of course. The question is, how does cyber terrorism affect public perceptions? The research on this topic is very, very limited. And most scholars tend to focus on the perpetrators themselves, as I talked a little earlier, and actually throughout the lecture so far. It was mostly the motivation for terror groups to use those tools and less to think about how the public, which is the main target of those tools, will react. In some of the recent work, there's scholars that use experimental designs to understand public opinion about those methods. Now, those studies are mostly focusing so far on cyber attacks, not necessarily cyber terrorism, but again, they provide us some initial understanding of the way that the public conceptualize those kinds of threats. So I want to talk about a study by Kostyuk and Wayne, which it's a study that was published a couple of weeks ago. They addressed the question of how does the public react to cyber threats. So they asked the questions of cyber attack, not cyber terrorism, but cyber attack not necessarily by a terror group. They're trying to identify whether there are differences in terms of perceptions when the threats have personal effect on the public members or it does not have, whether it's, if we go back to previous studies that I've talked about when we talked about public reactions to terrorism. So we had a national threat, which is a threat to the entire nation, or a personal threat, which is an individual threat to my well-being. Their theoretical concepts focus on risk perception based mostly on public understanding of this kind of threat. What exactly are cyber threats and how those understandings shapes their perception of those threats and their associated behavior, which is again intended to prevent severe damages from terrorism in cyberspace. So their basic argument is that the public understanding for what cyber attacks is very, very low. And they offer two reasons for that. First is low exposure. The vast majority of attacks that employ cyber tools are targeting government installations or government websites or large corporations in terms of information theft and data breaches. So it's not appearing in the news as much as conventional cyber attacks. And even when there is some debate about cyber attacks or cyber threats by elites and by the media, it's not as extended as other national security threats, including terrorism, conventional terrorism. The result from that is the threat perception is very, very limited. Cyber threats that do not seem like a personal threat, so it does not require much of an investment in terms of protection. The lack of severe implications makes it less likely that public members will place much emphasis on security threats. So the evidence that we have until today does not make it likely that those perceptions are going to change. And the fact that the emotional reaction to cyber operation is very, very different compared to conventional operations, again, only exacerbates this low threat perceptions. So they want to go a little bit deeper in their research on understanding those perceptions. So they, again, differentiate between a personal threat from a cyber attack to a more national types of threat. Their attack, the way that they conceptualize the attack in their research is that these are a data breach, so stealing of information from individuals, whether it is personally or more generally. They argue that when the attack is going to have personal ramification, it should heighten the threat perception, and the result of that will be more support for government policy of investment in prevention, and also those specific individuals which were personally harmed by the attack are more likely to engage in safer cyber behavior and being more cautious. So they use a series of experiments. They have partial support for those arguments. First of all, they show that the public's knowledge of what cyber terminology is, what cyber events are, is very, very limited. They show that when the attacks is personal, there is higher degree of threat about future attack. And this is just one finding from the research. As you can see on the top here, there is the personal threat versus national threat. Every one of those lines that's not touching the dash line, which is on the 0, is actually statistically significant, which means the effect is evident in the data. So this shows that when it's personal, the effect is actually substantial compared to when it's a national one. Those who were exposed to the threat have higher support for policy in terms of investment for prevention. And one of the interesting findings is that those who were personally targeted, so those who are under the personal threat group, claimed that they will engage in safer cyber behavior. But what they did is, after the experiment, they also tested this actual argument by those individuals in the last point here, in the fourth point. They used an actual method to check whether participants will actually behave as they reported. So they will engage in a safer cyber behavior. They send them to the email more information about attacks and like a pseudo phishing attack. And what they found, that was not the case. So those individuals said that they will engage in safer cyber behavior, but they did not actually do that. They did not look for additional information of how these threats might hurt them, and now they can counter that. So again, there's a problem between what people have stated in the experience to what they actually did in reality. So overall, much lower perception of the threat from cyber attacks, even if it has personal ramification. Lastly, I want to briefly talk about a current research project which I'm involved in. And in this project, we try to assess if the public, again, similar to the study by Kostyuk and Wayne, comprehends the threat of cyber terrorism and whether it can distinguish cyber attacks from conventional terrorism. We motivate our work based on data from public polls from the last couple of years. So this, for example, this is a poll from Gallup in 2016. As you can see, the public members see international terrorism as a very critical threat, and cyber terrorism is actually very, very close. So these numbers, and there's also numbers from more recent polls from 2018, which again shows pretty much similar numbers in terms of the way that the public conceptualize those threats. It may have two implications. One way, it means that the public knows what cyber terrorism is and what are the associated risks. So we think it's very, very severe threat we should think about. And the study by Kostyuk and Wayne actually discounted this argument. The other one is that the citizens are not really aware of what cyber terrorism is, and instead they just lump all types of terrorism into one category. So anything that is related to the word terrorism is dangerous and should be tracked by the government. So what do? We unpack those perception, arguing that the public should recognize what cyber threats are, because there are discussions in the media, and usually when the media discusses cyber terrorism, they tend to emphasize the risks that are associated. But because the low actual exposure for these kinds of threats, so it makes it much less likely that those things will actually happen. So policy preferences will not change significantly. So there's not going to be a very much difference in terms of policy preferences between conventional terrorism and cyber terrorism. So in order to see those very specific nuanced differences, we unpack the perception questions that there are in the survey that we study, and we separate between the questions of what is the likelihood of an attack compared to what are the expected costs. And this is just a basic finding that we have. What you can see here is that the public sees the likelihood of cyber attack, which this is the mean likelihood. It's on a 1 to 5 scale. It's very, very low compared to kinetic attack, which is conventional terrorism. At the same time, the expected cost for cyber terrorism is very, very high. This is in terms of casualties compared to kinetic terrorism. So this is exactly the opposite for those two types of terrorism. How can we explain those results? In terms of likelihood, it's pretty straightforward. There's a lot more conventional or kinetic terrorism incidents than cyber terrorism, so it's more likely that this is how the public is going to view that. In terms of the costs, we can think about elite discussions and media discussions. Again, when those discussions take place and cyber terrorism is invoked, we usually emphasize the potential severe damages from cyber attacks. We do not talk about very limited damages that exist now. They talk about what may happen if those kinds of an attack actually takes place. So that's going to be part of the explanation. Still, we use other measures in the survey, which I did not put on the slides because I didn't want to talk about it for 10 minutes, using the more general questions of how concerned are you from cyber terrorism compared to conventional or kinetic terrorism, and we find that cyber terrorism is a lot lower, which leads us to argue that what dominates the threat perception overall is the likelihood of an incident, which also means that the result is not very much likely to change. There's going to be less investment in cyber threat, which is similar to what Kostyuk and Wayne found at the previous papers I talked about, compared to investment in conventional terrorism. So that's, again, it's research that we're working on right now and provides an additional evidence that cyber terrorism does not seem to be a severe threat by the public. All right, so that's what we have on cyber terrorism. Is a very, very understudied topic. A lot more work is being conducted right now. You can read some of those works. You can look for a lot of reports online, not necessarily just research, but reports by government organizations, if you're interested in these topics. I'll finish today with a quick reminder again. If you have any questions about your final paper, about your final presentation, send them to me as soon as possible. You have less than 2 weeks until you have to submit those things. And I hope you're able to survive the way that things are right now, and you're still safe and you're staying home. And that's it. I will see all of you on Friday. Bye-bye.